Goodfellas is one of the most purely pleasurable films ever made. Henry Hill gliding through the Copacabana with a folded bill for every doorman, Sunday sauce on the stove, Jimmy Conway tipping everyone in the room. A life that looked from the right angle like the best possible version of belonging somewhere. Hollywood gave organized crime a narrator audiences could ride alongside for 2.5 hours without once wanting to get off. But the men that story was actually built on were nothing like that portrait. Paul Vario ran an operation federal prosecutors called one of the most dangerous criminal enterprises in New York, while keeping his name out of every newspaper in the city for 30 years. James Burke is estimated to have been responsible for somewhere between 60 and 70 deaths. Thomas DeSimone committed his first murder at 17 as an audition. The Lufthansa heist left a trail of bodies across 2 states that the film compressed into 3 minutes of screen time.
What you are about to hear is considerably worse than anything Martin Scorsese put on screen. Section 1. The movie that made the mob look cool. In September of 1990, Martin Scorsese released a film that would change the way American audiences thought about organized crime for the next 3 decades. The film was called Goodfellas. It ran for nearly 2.5 hours. It covered 30 years of life inside the Lucchese crime family through the eyes of a single narrator, a former associate named Henry Hill, who had turned federal witness a decade earlier, and who had agreed, in a series of recorded conversations with crime reporter Nicholas Pileggi, to describe that life from the inside. The book those conversations produced was called Wise Guy, published in January of 1985. The film that followed it was something else entirely. What Scorsese built from that material was one of the most visually confident pictures of its generation. The camera moved through the world of the Lucchese crew with a kind of breathless forward momentum that made the audience feel like they were being led into something. The Copacabana sequence, where Hill escorts his future wife through a side entrance, down a service corridor, through the kitchen, and into the main room of one of the most famous nightclubs in Manhattan, was shot in a single unbroken take that lasted nearly 3 minutes. The room opened up around them like a reward. Every doorman along the route took a folded bill. Every maitre d' along the route produced a better table than the one before it. By the time the two of them sat down in front of a small table that had materialized from nowhere at the edge of the stage, the audience had been shown, without a single line of dialogue explaining it, exactly what the appeal of this life was supposed to feel like. The 4 central figures in the film were drawn from real men who had worked inside Paul Vario's crew in East New York and South Ozone Park across the 1960s and 1970s. The screen versions and the real men shared certain surface details. They shared almost nothing else. Paulie Cicero, the calm and measured boss, played by Paul Sorvino, was built on Paul Vario, a Lucchese capo regime whom federal prosecutors would eventually describe in court documents as one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in the city of New York. The film kept his discipline and his low profile. It left out the body count underneath both. Jimmy Conway, played by Robert De Niro, with a kind of generous, effortless menace, was built on James Burke, an Irish-American associate who ran his operation out of a bar in South Ozone Park, and who would eventually be convicted of a murder he had ordered on one of his own crew members. Henry Hill would later estimate that Burke had been responsible for somewhere between 60 and 70 deaths across his career. The film kept his charm and his habit of tipping everyone in the room. It left out the refrigerated trailer. Tommy DeVito, played by Joe Pesci in a performance that won him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in March of 1991, was built on Thomas DeSimone, a figure who had committed his first documented murder at the age of 17, and who had been carrying a loaded revolver inside a brown paper bag through the streets of Brooklyn since his mid-teens. Pesci played the role at 46 years old, short and volcanic. The real DeSimone was in his 20s through most of the events the film covers. Tall, physically imposing, and described by people who knew him as methodical rather than impulsive. The narrator, Henry Hill himself, was the one figure the film drew most directly from the source. Ray Liotta played him as a man who understood what he had walked into, who saw the machinery clearly, and who eventually made the only rational decision available to him. The real Hill, by the time the film was released, had been kicked out of federal witness protection, had been arrested multiple times on narcotics and weapons charges, and was managing a public profile that involved regular appearances on morning radio programs, sometimes audibly intoxicated before noon. The gap between the screen versions and the real figures was not accidental. Scorsese and Pileggi, who co-wrote the screenplay together, made deliberate choices about what to include and what to leave out. Some of those choices were practical. A film that showed every documented act of violence connected to the real Vario crew would have required a runtime closer to 6 hours than 2.5. Some of those choices were aesthetic. The film was built to put the audience inside the appeal of the life before it showed them the cost. The cost, when it came, was designed to land harder because of everything that had come before it. What the film could not do, within the constraints of its own design, was show the audience the full texture of what the Lucchese organization actually looked like from the inside. The Sunday sauce was real. The tipping was real. The nightclubs through the kitchen were real. Underneath all of it was an organization that ran on fear, that eliminated its own members when they became inconvenient, and that left a trail of unrecovered bodies across 2 states stretching back 40 years before Henry Hill ever sat down across from a federal agent and began talking. The book that preceded the film was closer to that texture. Pileggi had spent 2 years recording Hill in witness protection, and the material he gathered was more granular, more violent, and more specific than anything the film had room for. The screen adaptation took the architecture of that material and covered it in the visual grammar of a story audiences could inhabit comfortably for 2.5 hours. The result was a portrait of organized crime that has shaped every gangster film made in the 35 years since its release, and that left the actual record of what the Lucchese crew did sitting mostly undisturbed in the federal court documents and the unread sections of the Pileggi book. That record is what the next 9 sections are going to cover. The real figures, the real operations, the real violence, and the real endings. None of it looks like the Copacabana sequence. Most of it does not look like anything Scorsese put on screen at all. The film gave American audiences a version of the Lucchese crew they could sit with comfortably for 2.5 hours. The real crew was something the film could only ever gesture at. Next, we go back to a block in East New York in 1955, a cab stand across the street from a family apartment, and the 12-year-old boy who crossed the street and asked the men inside for a job. Section 2. The Real Henry Hill. On June 11, 1943, in the Manhattan borough of New York City, a boy was born to an Irish father and a Sicilian mother in a working-class household that already had more children than money. His name was Henry Hill Jr. His father, Henry Hill Sr., had emigrated from Ireland and worked as an electrician. His mother, Carmela, was the daughter of Sicilian immigrants and took in dressmaking work when the family needed the extra income. The Hills eventually settled on a block in the section of Brooklyn that sat at the border of Brownsville and East New York, a neighborhood that during the late 1940s and early 1950s was producing a steady stream of young men who would go on to work for the Lucchese organization. The block that mattered most was the one right outside the family apartment. Across the street sat the Euclid Avenue Cab Company, a cab stand that dispatched almost no taxis, and a pizzeria called Presto that served a small amount of pizza. Both addresses were operated as fronts for a Lucchese crew run by a capo regime named Paul Vario. Vario's brother, Vito, known in the neighborhood as Tuddy, managed the day-to-day work at both locations. The actual business happening behind those 2 storefronts was bookmaking, loan sharking,
hijacking coordination, and the fencing of stolen merchandise. To a boy looking out the window of the apartment across the street, the men who walked in and out of those buildings were the most important figures on the block. They wore good suits, they drove good cars, they paid for everything in cash. Every other adult on the street treated them with a kind of careful deference that no electrician's son in Brownsville had ever seen directed at anyone else. In 1955, at the age of 12, Henry Hill crossed the street and asked the men at the cab stand for work. It was the central decision of his life.
Vario's people put him to work running errands, parking cars, and learning the routine of how the front businesses operated. The pay was small, the exposure was constant. Within 2 years, Hill had been placed onto a construction job the Vario operation controlled, where he received a portion of a paycheck for work he was not required to perform. He kept some of the money and gave the rest to his mother. He used the legitimate cover of the construction payroll to drop out of school without telling his parents. What Hill could never be, no matter how long he stayed or how much he earned, was a formally inducted member of the organization. The American Mafia had operated since the early 1930s under a rule that required full Italian descent on both sides for induction. Hill's Irish father disqualified him permanently. He could earn for the family. He could be trusted with serious work. He could sit at the table on Sunday. He could never take the oath. The figures above him could never afford to forget that distinction, and in the end, neither could he. The two figures who shaped the next 2.5 decades of his life both came from inside the Vario crew. The first was James Burke, 12 years older than Hill, already a veteran of significant prison time, and building a reputation as a hijacker and enforcer whose charm in public rooms bore almost no relationship to what he was capable of in private ones. Burke took an interest in Hill almost immediately. He treated him like a younger brother, brought him along on jobs, and gave him the kind of consistent mentorship that the cab stand across from his apartment had never quite formalized. The second figure was Thomas D. Simone, who arrived in Vario's orbit in 1965 at the age of 15, 10 years younger than Hill and already known on the block as someone you did not provoke under any circumstances. The three of them worked together across the next 13 years on hijackings, fencing operations, the Air France robbery at Kennedy Airport in 1967, and the Lufthansa heist in December of 1978. Hill was arrested on narcotics charges in May of 1980. By the time he sat down in the Nassau County Jail and agreed to talk to federal investigators, Burke and Vario had already been recorded on surveillance audio discussing the need to have him removed. The two men who had brought him in at 12 years old had decided he was a liability. The decision made the next part easy. Hill entered federal witness protection in the summer of 1980 with his wife Karen and their 2 children. The family was relocated multiple times across the following 7 years, living in Nebraska, Kentucky, and Washington State under new names and new biographical covers. The covers did not hold. Hill was giving interviews under his real name during the same period he was supposed to be operating anonymously. He was cooperating with Pileggi on the book that would become Wise Guy. He was also using cocaine with enough regularity that his handlers inside the program were receiving complaints from neighbors at multiple relocation addresses. The federal government removed the family from the program in 1987, following a narcotics arrest in Seattle. The film adaptation released in 1990 showed none of this. The screen version of Hill ended with a man walking out of a safe house in a bathrobe, complaining about the quality of the pasta available in witness protection, and staring into the camera with the flat resignation of someone who had traded a dangerous life for a boring one. The real Hill, in the years that followed, was arrested on narcotics charges, weapons charges, and public intoxication charges across multiple states. He appeared on The Howard Stern Show repeatedly, often by phone, often audibly drunk before noon. He sold pasta sauce under his own name. He sold paintings on eBay. He wrote a cookbook. He gave paid appearances at organized crime-themed dinners where audiences paid to sit across from the man who had testified against his entire crew. He died of heart failure at a Los Angeles hospital on June 12, 2012, the day after his 69th birthday. His fiancée told reporters he had gone out peacefully. The cause of death was officially recorded as complications from chronic heart disease, a condition his lifetime of heavy smoking and substance use had accelerated significantly across his final decade. He was 69 years old. The cab stand on Pine Street had been the entry point. A hospital bed in Los Angeles was the exit. Everything in between is what the next 8 sections are going to cover. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Henry Hill was the narrator, the cooperating witness, and the man whose testimony put 50 people away. But the crew he testified against was built around figures whose real histories were far darker than anything the film had room to show. Next, we go to the junkyard on Avenue D, the bar called Gefkin's, and the man the federal government called one of the most violent career criminals in the city of New York. Section 3. Paul Vario, the junkyard boss. On July 10, 1914, in Brooklyn, a boy was born into a Sicilian-American family that had already begun moving its sons toward the kind of street work the neighborhood offered. His name was Paul Vario. The family settled in East New York. By the age of 11, he had already been sent to juvenile detention on a truancy charge, the first entry in what would become one of the longest criminal records in the borough. He grew up large, physically imposing, and slow to speak. He had a quality that the men around him would describe across the next 5 decades in almost identical terms. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. By his late teenage years, Vario had attached himself to the organization that would, after the internal war of 1930 and 1931, that reorganized the New York families, eventually take the name of the boss, Tommy Lucchese. The early work was the standard apprenticeship of his generation: numbers running, small collections, errand work for older figures who were building their own operations. He learned the structure from the bottom. By the time he was in his 30s, he had climbed far enough inside it to begin building something of his own. What he built did not look from the outside like the kind of operation that would eventually produce federal estimates of $25,000 a day in earnings. He had no interest in visibility. He operated almost entirely out of 2 locations. The first was a bar in East New York called Gefkin's, an old German establishment where he held court most afternoons at a back table with the lighting kept deliberately low. The second was a junkyard on Avenue D, where the front gate processed a legitimate trade in scrap metal, and the back office handled the actual work. He kept the volume of his daily business so far below the level of newspaper coverage that for years, federal investigators struggled to assemble a clear picture of what was actually moving through those 2 addresses. What was moving through them by the early 1970s was an operation that federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the borough. The income came from bookmaking across East New York, loan sharking at street rates that climbed into the hundreds of % annually, the fencing of hijacked merchandise, and a controlling interest in the cargo unions managing freight at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Henry Hill would later describe the airport in a phrase that became one of the most quoted lines in the literature on the Lucchese family as the crew's personal bank. FBI surveillance recordings from the 1980s captured Lucchese members boasting on tape that the family owned JFK. The boast was not entirely an exaggeration. Vario's influence over the cargo haulers union was sufficient that the threat of a work stoppage could redirect pressure away from his crew almost on demand. His position inside the Lucchese organization climbed steadily through the 1960s. After a prison release in 1962, he was named capo regime and given formal oversight of his own crew. By the time Carmine Tramunti became boss of the family in 1967, Vario was functioning as an informal advisor to the structure above him, the figure other capos came to for counsel on disputes the boss himself did not want to handle directly. He held no title above capo regime. He sat on no commission. The men in the family understood, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that the decisions Paul Vario made at the back table in Gefkin's tended to hold regardless. The screen version of Vario, played by Paul Sorvino in the 1990 film, was a calm and almost paternal figure who hosted Sunday dinners, dispensed measured advice, and managed his crew with the kind of low authority a Hollywood audience could respect without discomfort. The real Vario, according to the federal prosecutors who built the case against him in the early 1980s, was something the screenplay never found room for. The phrase used in court documents was that he was one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in the city of New York. The phrase did not appear in any version of the film. The violence sat underneath the discipline in a way that made it difficult to document from the outside. Vario had 4 brothers who worked inside the operation. Tuddy ran the cab stand in the pizzeria on Pine Street. Vito and Lenny handled other pieces of the structure. The Vario family business was, in the most literal possible sense, a family business, with blood connections running through every layer of the operation and insulating the center from the kind of exposure that brought down less carefully organized crews. His son Peter Vario would eventually be named, in Henry Hill's account, as one of the figures involved in luring Thomas de Simone to his death in January of 1979. The killing was carried out as a favor to the Gambino organization, which had spent nearly 9 years waiting for the right moment to settle the score for the unauthorized murder of one of their made men. Vario gave the permission. His own son helped carry out the arrangement. The father figure warmth the film assigned to the character of Paulie Cicero was not entirely invented. It sat on top of something the film never showed. What finally brought Vario down was not surveillance, not an informant inside his own crew, and not a federal investigation that had been building for years. It was Henry Hill, sitting in a Nassau County jail in the spring of 1980, listening to a surveillance recording of Vario discussing the need to have him removed, and deciding in that moment that the man who had given him his first job at 12 years old was no longer someone he owed anything to. Following Hill's cooperation, Vario was indicted in 1984 on fraud charges connected to a scheme to obtain a forged driver's license for Hill while Hill was serving federal time. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years. While serving that sentence, he was indicted again in 1985 on extortion charges tied to the airport rackets his crew had controlled for nearly 2 decades. He was convicted a second time and sentenced to an additional 10 years. He never came out of federal custody. Paul Vario died of lung failure at the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Worth, Texas, on May 3, 1988. He was 73 years old. The man Paul Sorvino had been hired to portray in a film that would begin production the following year was already in the ground before the cameras rolled. The junkyard on Avenue D was gone. The bar at Gefkin's was gone. The back table where he had held court for 30 years was empty. What remained was a federal case file and a body count the film would only ever gesture at from a careful distance. Vario ran the operation from the back of a junkyard and kept his name out of the newspapers for 30 years.
The man who worked most closely beneath him was the opposite in almost every visible way: generous in public rooms, dangerous in private ones, and responsible for a body count that federal investigators were still uncovering decades after his death. Next, we go to Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park and the Irish-American associate who tipped every doorman in Manhattan. Section 4. Jimmy Burke, the Irishman who could never be made. On July 5, 1931, in the borough of Manhattan, a boy was born to an Irish immigrant mother and a father whose name was never recorded in any document that survived. The surname on his birth certificate was Conway. The name he would carry for the rest of his life, Burke, came from one of the foster families that took him in during his early childhood. His mother had placed him into the system when he was 2 years old. He moved between several placements across the next decade. What is documented is that by the age of 13, the foster father he was living with was killed in a car accident with Burke in the vehicle, and the foster mother who remained turned on him in the aftermath. He began running away. He began stealing. He began the slow drift into juvenile detention that would define the rest of his teenage years. By the early 1950s, he had built associations with figures inside both the Lucchese and Colombo organizations. His Irish parentage permanently disqualified him from formal induction into the American Mafia, the same wall that would eventually close in front of Henry Hill. He could earn. He could be trusted with serious work. He could sit at the table. He could never take the oath. That limitation defined the shape of his entire career. What he became inside Paul Vario's crew was the kind of associate the structure depended on, but could never fully protect. He hijacked trucks feeding into Kennedy Airport with a consistency that made him one of the most productive earners in the crew. He ran a loan sharking book whose rates climbed into the hundreds of %. He operated everything out of his own bar in South Ozone Park called Robert's Lounge, where he hosted parties, held planning sessions, and, according to Hill's later testimony, had at least 2 men buried in the basement before being moved. His nickname was Jimmy the Gent, earned through his habit of pressing folded bills into the hands of every doorman, bartender, and waiter he encountered across Manhattan. The image it constructed was useful. A generous, well-mannered figure who paid for everything in cash was a productive cover for a man running one of the most violent crews in the borough. The 3 of them, Burke, Hill, and DeSimone, worked the Air France robbery at Kennedy Airport in 1967, pulling an estimated $420,000 from a cargo terminal in a job that received almost no press coverage. The Air France job was the prototype. Everything Burke learned from it went into the Lufthansa heist 11 years later. Burke was convicted in 1982 on conspiracy charges connected to the Boston College point-shaving scheme and sentenced to 12 years. While serving that sentence, he was convicted in 1985 of the murder of Richard Eaton and sentenced to 20 years to life. He died of cancer at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York, on April 13, 1996. He was 64 years old, had spent the final 14 years of his life inside federal custody, and would not have been eligible for parole on the Eaton sentence until he was well into his 80s. The doormen he had tipped across 30 years of Manhattan nights were still working their doors. The man who had made everyone in the room feel taken care of died in a federal medical facility without a single member of his crew left standing to visit. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Burke built his reputation on charm and loyalty and spent the last 14 years of his life in federal custody because the man he had mentored since the age of 12 sat down across from a federal agent and told them everything. Next, we go to the streets of Brooklyn in the mid-1960s, and the teenager who walked into Paul Vario's crew at 15 years old, carrying a revolver inside a brown paper bag. Section 5. Tommy DeSimone, the brown paper bag.
On June 6, 1946, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a boy was born into a family that had already placed multiple generations of men inside the American Mafia. His name was Thomas James DeSimone. His father was a known figure whose associations stretched back to the Los Angeles underworld of the 1930s. His older brothers, Anthony and Robert, would both eventually become associates of the Gambino crime family in New York. The family relocated to Brooklyn while Tommy was still a child, and by his early teenage years, he was moving through the same East New York streets that had produced Henry Hill and the rest of the Vario crew. The connections his family already carried inside the New York organizations meant that the introduction to Paul Vario, when it came, required almost no arrangement at all. In 1965, at the age of 15, DeSimone went to work for the Vario crew. He was placed alongside Henry Hill, who was already 22 and a veteran of the operation, and James Burke, who took an immediate interest in the younger figure and began treating him as something close to a protege. Hill would later describe his first impression of DeSimone in the recorded conversations he gave Nicholas Pileggi across the early 1980s. He remembered a skinny young man in a suit cut for someone older, with a thin mustache he had grown to look the part, who carried himself with the kind of compensating intensity that belonged to a kid who had already decided in advance that he was going to be respected, or he was going to be dead trying. The screen version of the figure, played by Joe Pesci in the 1990 film, won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in March of 1991. Pesci was 46 years old when the film was shot. The character he played was short, wiry, and middle-aged, a volcanic presence who killed in moments of explosive and unpredictable rage. The real Thomas DeSimone, across the years the film actually covers, was a man in his 20s. He was tall. He was physically imposing. He reportedly drank a gallon of whole milk a day. The physical difference between the screen version and the documented figure was significant. The behavioral difference was more significant still. The detail that survives most consistently across every account of DeSimone is the brown paper bag. He walked through the streets of Brooklyn with a .38 caliber revolver folded inside an ordinary paper bag of the kind a man might carry lunch home from a deli in. The bag was the operational tool. He could approach a target on a public sidewalk in broad daylight, holding what looked like an errand, and have the weapon clear of the bag before the figure across from him understood what was happening. The technique was the opposite of what the screen portrayal suggested. It was not a temper. It was a method. It was a way of doing the work in the open without ever drawing attention until the moment the trigger was already moving. His first documented murder came at the age of 17. The figure he killed was a man named Howard Goldstein. The killing was not for money, not for territory, and not for any personal grievance that has ever been recorded in the public documents. According to the Hill account given to Pileggi, DeSimone shot Goldstein on the street to demonstrate to the older members of the Vario crew that he was willing to do the work. It was an audition. The target was selected because he was available, not because of anything he had done. The detail is one of the most quietly disturbing in the entire Pileggi book. And it is one of the details the film removed entirely. The screen version of Tommy DeVito commits his first on-screen killing as an adult, in a moment of personal grievance with a recognizable emotional logic. The real DeSimone began his career as a teenager who killed a stranger to qualify for the room. The murder that would eventually seal his own fate came in June of 1970. William Bentvena, a Gambino-made man who had just completed 8 years of federal time on a narcotics conviction, attended his own welcome home party at Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park. Bentvena and DeSimone had a history of minor friction, going back to DeSimone's early years on the block. At the party, Bentvena, drinking and performing for the room, asked DeSimone whether he still shined shoes. The remark was a reference to a job DeSimone had held as a young teenager, a detail he had spent years trying to distance himself from.
DeSimone, who carried a specific and long-running sense of being underestimated by the figures around him, took the remark as the most serious insult of his life. 2 weeks later, DeSimone and Burke ended Bentvena's life. The full sequence will be covered in the next section. What matters here is the consequence that began accumulating from the moment the killing was carried out. Bentvena was a formally inducted member of the Gambino organization. Under the rules Charles Luciano had codified in 1931, the killing of a made man without commission approval carried an automatic death sentence for the figure who had carried it out.
DeSimone had killed a made man at a welcome home party because the man had made a joke about his teenage job. The Gambino organization noted the violation and began the slow process of building the case they would eventually need to present to Paul Vario. Further killings followed across the next 8 years. A bartender named Michael Gianco was shot in the thigh during an argument over a forgotten drink at a card game, recovered, returned to work in a leg cast, told DeSimone to go to hell when the subject came up again, and was shot dead on the spot.
The sequence appears in the film almost verbatim and is played as one of Pesci's signature scenes. A figure named Ronald Giroth, killed in 1974, had been a personal protege of a rising Gambino capo named John Gotti. DeSimone had now killed 2 people connected to Gotti's operation without asking anyone's permission. The clock that had started in June of 1970 was running faster. His final documented murder came in December of 1978, in the days after the Lufthansa heist, when he and Angelo Seppi shot a Burke associate named Parnell Edwards in his Brooklyn apartment. Edwards had failed to dispose of the getaway van after the airport job, and the vehicle had been found by police with fingerprints inside it. DeSimone himself disappeared within weeks of that killing. The brown paper bag, the .38,
And the man who had carried both for 13 years all left the streets of Brooklyn at almost exactly the same moment. He was 28 years old when he disappeared. He was declared legally dead in 1990. His body has never been recovered. The screen version of his death, shown in the film as a quick shot to the back of the head in a clean room, was the merciful version. The actual record points to something slower, carried out in a location that none of the surviving accounts have ever been able to specifically name. DeSimone's killing of a Gambino-made man in 1970 set a chain of consequences in motion that would take 9 years to arrive at their conclusion. But before that clock ran out, there was a night in June of 1970 at a bar in South Ozone Park, a shoeshine remark, and a 2-week sequence that the film compressed into a single evening. Next, we go to the Billy Batts killing, and everything the screen left out of it. Section 6. The Billy Batts killing, and the 2 weeks after. On February 22, 1933, in Manhattan, a boy was born to a first-generation Sicilian-Italian father and an Irish immigrant mother. His name was William Joseph Bentvena. The family eventually settled in the Arverne section of Queens. The early biographical record on the figure is unusually thin. What is documented is that by the late 1950s, he had been pulled into a narcotics smuggling operation run by a Lucchese capo named John Ormento, working alongside figures including Carmine Galante and Anthony Mira. The group was eventually named the Ormento Group in federal indictments. Bentvena joined it in May of 1958 at the age of 25. The narcotics arrest came on February 14, 1959, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where Bentvena had traveled to complete a delivery on behalf of 2 other figures in the operation. Undercover officers took him into custody. The federal trial that followed produced a conviction in June of 1962. Bentvena was sentenced to 15 years and was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury, Connecticut. At some point between his original induction and his sentencing, he had been formally inducted into the Gambino family. The move from one organization to another was unusual, but not unheard of in that period,
and his connections through the narcotics operation had reportedly opened the door. By the time he walked out of Danbury in May of 1970, he was a Gambino soldier with 8 years of federal time behind him, a nickname the street had given him, and a personal friendship with a rising figure in the family named John Gotti. The nickname was Billy Bats. The origin of the name has never been settled in any source that has examined it. What is settled is that Benvina was, in the language of the organization, a made man. A formally inducted member of one of the 5 families operating under the rules Charles Luciano had codified in 1931.
Under those rules, the killing of a made man by an outside figure required the explicit prior approval of the Mafia Commission. A killing carried out without that approval carried an automatic sentence for the figure who had done it. The target almost never learned about the violation in advance. The men who had carried it out would learn, in time, that the proof had reached the right hands. The welcome home party for Benvina was held at Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park in May of 1970. The location was Jimmy Burke's bar. The guests included most of the Vario crew. Thomas DeSimone was present. Henry Hill was present. The conversation that the entire evening turned on happened between Benvina and DeSimone at some point during the night. The 2 men had known each other in passing during DeSimone's early years on the block. Benvina, drinking and performing for the room the way a man does after 8 years inside federal walls, asked DeSimone whether he still shined shoes. The remark was a reference to a teenage job DeSimone had held and had spent years trying to erase from the way the neighborhood remembered him. For a figure who had been carrying a loaded revolver through the streets of Brooklyn since the age of 15 and who had already killed multiple people, the suggestion that the room still associated him with a shoe shine stand was the kind of insult that did not leave once it entered. There was a second element underneath the personal grievance that the film left out entirely. While Benvina had been serving his federal sentence, Burke had taken over the loan sharking book that had been Benvina's primary source of income before his arrest. Benvina, on his release, had asked for the book back. Burke had refused. The shoeshine remark was the spark that lit the sequence. The book was the reason the sequence had already been close to igniting before the party started. The film adaptation collapsed what followed into a single evening. The screen version shows DeSimone, Burke, and Hill ending Benvina's life in the trunk of a car on the road back from the bar. The same night the insult was delivered. The real sequence took 2 weeks. DeSimone spent that period talking openly inside the crew about what he intended to do. Hill and Burke both understood that the killing would carry the automatic sentence the rules had established 40 years earlier. DeSimone appeared not to care, or had concluded that the calculation was worth it. The 2 weeks of open discussion inside the crew about a planned murder of a made man is one of the details that most clearly illustrates the distance between the film's version of how the organization operated and the way it actually functioned on the ground. The killing itself took place at a second bar 2 weeks after the welcome home party. DeSimone pistol-whipped Benvina until he stopped moving. Burke joined him. Hill, by his own account, kept watch at the door. The 3 men carried what they believed was a lifeless figure to Hill's car and placed him in the trunk. They stopped at DeSimone's mother's house to collect a knife, a bag of lime, and a shovel. The plan from that point was to drive north to a dog kennel in upstate New York that Burke had access to through a contact, and to bury the figure on the property. What happened during the drive is the detail the film handles in its own compressed way, and that Hill described in direct terms across multiple interviews over the following decades. Benvina had not been dead in the trunk. Sounds began coming from the back of the car during the drive north. DeSimone and Burke pulled over. They opened the trunk. The figure inside was still alive. The 2 men finished the killing with a shovel and a tire iron.
Hill, recalling the sequence on the audio commentary recorded for the 1990 film and again in later interviews, described what he witnessed as the most disturbing thing he had seen across 25 years inside the organization. He said the figure had been stabbed 30 or 40 times before the breathing finally stopped. The specific number has never been independently verified, but the broad account has been consistent across every version Hill gave of it. The body was buried at the dog kennel in upstate New York the same night. 3 months later, the owner of the kennel informed Burke that the land had been sold to a property developer. Burke ordered Hill and DeSimone to return to the site and move the remains. The two men went back, exhumed what was left, and according to Hill's account in the Pileggi book, eventually disposed of the remains through a mechanical compactor at a junkyard in New Jersey. On the audio commentary for the film, Hill gave a slightly different version, saying the body had first been moved to the basement of Robert's lounge before the trip to the compactor. The two accounts have never been reconciled in any source that has examined them. The Gambino organization did not, in the summer of 1970, know with certainty who had killed William Bentvena. The information that would eventually give them the proof they needed to act would not arrive in their hands for another 8 years. When it did, the clock on Thomas DeSimone, which had been running since the night of the welcome home party, began moving toward its conclusion. The film gave that conclusion a clean and quick ending in an empty room. The actual record, assembled from Hill's accounts and from the statements of figures who were present in the organization during the period, points to something that took considerably longer and happened in a location that has never been precisely identified in any document that has entered the public record. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Billy Batts killing set the terms for everything that followed inside the Vario crew across the next 9 years. But before those terms came due, there was a December night in 1978, a cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport, and the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. Next, we go to the Lufthansa heist, and the part of the story the film could only ever show in fragments. Section 7. The Lufthansa heist. The information that produced the largest cash robbery in American history at the time came from a man who owed money he could not pay back. His name was Louis Werner. He was a cargo agent employed by Lufthansa German Airlines at their air freight terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, and he had been working that job long enough to know the monthly schedule in precise detail. Once a month, the airline flew bundles of United States currency back into the country from West Germany. The cash was the accumulated proceeds of American servicemen and tourists who had been exchanging dollars for Deutschmarks at military bases and currency exchange points across Europe. It was converted back into dollars in Frankfurt, loaded onto a flight, carried across the Atlantic, and stored inside a high-security vault at Building 261 of the cargo terminal until Brink's armored trucks arrived to move it into the banking system. Werner owed $20,000 to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman, who ran his operation out of a wig shop in Queens and who was a known associate of the Vario crew. Werner told Krugman about the vault. Krugman passed the information to Henry Hill. Hill passed it to Jimmy Burke. Burke confirmed the operational details through his own airport contacts and took the proposal to Paul Vario. Vario gave the approval. The information had traveled from a cargo agent with a gambling debt through 4 separate figures before it reached the man who would turn it into an operation. Burke planned the job out of the back room at Robert's Lounge across the months following Vario's approval. The crew he assembled was small and deliberate. 6 men in ski masks would carry out the entry. Vincent Asaro, a captain in the Bonanno organization whose family controlled the airport territory, was brought in for a share of the proceeds.
a move designed to keep peace between the two families and provide cover across organizational lines. Thomas De Simone was placed inside the entry team. Angelo Seppi, a Burke loyalist with a long record of airport work, was placed alongside him. Joe Manry, a heavy-set associate the crew called Buddha, rounded out the entry team. Parnell Edwards, a longtime Burke associate, was assigned the single most consequential cleanup task of the entire operation. He was responsible for disposing of the van once the score was complete. At approximately 3 in the morning on Monday, December 11, 1978, a black Ford Econoline van pulled up to the perimeter of Building 261. The crew cut the padlock at the gate with bolt cutters and moved inside wearing ski masks and gloves. The first employee they encountered was a senior cargo agent named John Murray, working the overnight shift. Murray was taken into the terminal lunchroom where 5 other Lufthansa employees were on a meal break. All 6 were ordered flat on the floor with their eyes closed. Murray was then directed to call upstairs to Rudy Eyrich, the night shift cargo traffic manager who held the vault codes. Eyrich came down, joined the others, and was made to disable the alarm system. 2 additional employees who returned to the building or stepped outside during the operation were brought in the same way. The total number of workers detained reached 10. None were physically harmed beyond what was required to move them into position. What the crew found inside the vault was significantly more than Werner had told Krugman to expect. The estimate passed up the chain had placed the cash at approximately $2 million. The actual contents were 50 boxes, each containing $125,000 in United States currency, alongside a separate container of jewelry, German currency, and silver. The total taken was approximately $5,875,000 in cash and just under $1 million in additional valuables. Adjusted into current terms, the figure runs to roughly $29 million. The crew loaded the vault contents into the van in under an hour. The full operation from the bolt cutters at the gate to the van pulling away from the terminal took approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. No shots were fired. The employees were left bound, but alive. The van moved off airport property and onto the surface streets of Queens in the early hours before dawn. Everything that followed depended on Parnell Edwards completing his assigned task. The van was to be driven to a New Jersey junkyard that night and fed through a mechanical compactor, eliminating the most significant piece of physical evidence connecting the crew to the terminal. Edwards did not make the trip. He drove the van to the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, parked it at a fire hydrant, and went home. Police found the vehicle 2 days later. The fingerprints recovered from inside it gave federal investigators their first documented connection between the crew and the cargo terminal. The largest cash robbery in American history began to unravel because one man parked a van at a fire hydrant and went to sleep. The cash and the jewelry from the Lufthansa vault have never been recovered. No member of the entry team was ever convicted of the robbery itself. The federal government spent decades attempting to build a case that would hold in court and came away without a single conviction on the central charge. What Burke did in the weeks after the score is the part of the story that the film reduced to a brief montage. The actual record is considerably longer and considerably darker. The Lufthansa heist produced the largest cash robbery in American history and left no one convicted of carrying it out. What it also produced in the weeks that followed was a systematic removal of every person who could place Jimmy Burke in the planning room. Next, we go to the killings that came after the score, and the part of the story Scorsese could only ever show in fragments. Section 8. The Killings That Followed. In the week between Christmas and New Year's of 1978, 17 days after the Lufthansa score, Jimmy Burke had already made his decision. Every man who could place him in the planning sessions at Robert's Lounge was going to have to disappear. The cash was safe. The jewelry was safe. The van had been found, but the van was the only thread investigators had.
Burke intended to make sure that thread led nowhere. The first to go was Parnell Edwards. The man who had parked the van at the fire hydrant and gone home had cost the crew its single best chance at a clean exit. On December 18, 1978, 7 days after the heist, Thomas DeSimone and Angelo Sepe went to Edwards' apartment in Ozone Park. Edwards opened the door.
They shot him inside the apartment. He was 34 years old. The body was the first in a sequence that would continue across the following 6 months, with a consistency that federal investigators would later describe as one of the most systematic internal cleanups they had documented inside any New York organized crime family. Martin Krugman was next. Krugman was the bookmaker whose wig shop in Queens had been the original entry point for Werner's information about the vault. He had been complaining openly in the weeks after the heist that his share of the proceeds had not arrived. According to Hill's later testimony, Burke and Sepe killed and dismembered Krugman approximately 1 month after the robbery. His body has never been recovered. The complaints about the money stopped when Krugman stopped being reachable. Teresa Ferrara was a beautician in her late 20s who had personal connections to multiple members of the Burke crew, including DeSimone and Sepe. Burke had reason to believe she was in contact with federal investigators. Her headless torso washed ashore on a beach in Barnegat, New Jersey, in May of 1979. The remains were eventually identified through dental records. She has never been named as a formal target in any prosecution connected to the heist, but the timing of her death and her documented connections to the crew placed her squarely inside the pattern Burke was running across the spring of that year. Richard Eaton was a Burke associate who had been laundering portions of the heist cash through a Florida operation. He had also, according to Burke's belief at the time, stolen approximately $250,000 from the proceeds. On February 18, 1979, 2 children playing in an abandoned lot in Brooklyn discovered Eaton's body inside a refrigerated tractor trailer. He had been hogtied. His body was frozen. A small address book sewn into the lining of his clothing contained the name and phone number of James Burke, a detail that handed investigators their second documented connection between Burke and the chain of disappearances that had followed the airport job. Joe Manry, the heavy-set associate the crew had called Buddha, had been one of the masked men inside the terminal on the night of the heist. He had been spending heavily in the weeks after the score in a way that was drawing attention. Manry was found shot in the back of the head in a parked car in Queens on May 16, 1979. Alongside another heist participant named Robert McMahon. Both men had been killed at close range with a small-caliber weapon. Louis Kafora and his wife Joanna had provided logistical support to the operation. Both were reported missing in March of 1979. Neither body has ever been recovered. The total number of lives Burke is believed to have ended in direct connection to the Lufthansa cleanup has never been settled in any single source. A documentary produced in 2012 placed the figure at 13. Federal investigators working the case at the time placed it between 8 and 10. Hill's own account across multiple tellings placed it slightly above 10. The exact number cannot be confirmed because several of the missing figures were never recovered, and several of the recovered bodies were never formally tied to the heist in any prosecution that reached a verdict. What the 1990 film showed of this sequence was 3 or 4 killings compressed into a montage that ran approximately 3 minutes of screen time. What the actual record shows is 6 to 9 months of methodical removal carried out across 2 states by a crew that had decided in advance that the score was worth more than the lives of the men who had carried it out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Burke spent the months after the Lufthansa heist removing everyone who could connect him to the planning room. But the man he could not remove was the one who had already been promised something he wanted more than money. Next, we go to January of 1979. and the empty room Thomas DeSimone walked into, believing it was his induction ceremony. Section 9. The disappearance of Thomas DeSimone. In the last week of December 1978, 2 weeks after the Lufthansa score, Thomas DeSimone received a message through Paul Vario's people. He was being put forward to be made. The formal induction ceremony, the taking of the oath that turned an associate into a soldier inside an American Mafia family, was the moment DeSimone had been waiting for since he was 15 years old. He had spent 13 years inside the Vario crew, believing the call would eventually come. The fact that it was arriving in the days after the largest cash robbery in American history made it look, from where he was standing, like a reward for the work he had carried out inside Building 261. What DeSimone did not know was that Paul Vario had already given his permission for the killing. The Gambino organization had, by some route the Hill account never fully explained, finally received the proof it needed on who had ended the life of William Bentvina in June of 1970. A Gambino-made man had been killed without commission approval. The rules required an automatic response. The Gambinos had taken their proof to Vario, presented the case, and asked for permission to move on the figure inside his own crew. Vario had agreed. There was a second element underneath the organizational obligation. While Henry Hill had been serving federal time in the mid-1970s, DeSimone had reportedly made a physical attempt on Karen Hill in the apartment she shared with their children. Hill described the incident in his 1994 book. Vario, who had maintained a personal relationship with Karen Hill across the same period, had been informed of what DeSimone had done. The permission Vario gave the Gambinos was not purely procedural. Hill and Burke were in Florida on separate business when the arrangement was finalized. DeSimone remained in New York, preparing for the ceremony he believed was coming. According to Hill's account, Peter Vario, the capo's son, and a Lucchese associate named Bruno Facciolo brought DeSimone to an unmarked location on the evening of January 14, 1979. The location was not what he had been told it was. The room was nearly empty. The ceremony was not going to take place. The exact sequence of what happened next has never been settled in the public record. A 1985 statement by Gambino associate Joseph Iannuzzi attributed the killing to a figure named Thomas Agro. Hill's 1994 account placed John Gotti himself in the room, and Hill claimed in a 2007 appearance on The Howard Stern Show that the death had taken considerable time because Bentvina had been a personal friend of Gotti's, and Gotti had wanted DeSimone to understand what the evening was for before it was finished. DeSimone's wife reported him missing the same day. His body has never been recovered. He was declared legally dead in 1990. He was 28 years old at the time of his disappearance. The screen version of his death, shown in the film as a quick shot to the back of the head in a clean and anonymous room, was the version that required the least from the audience. The actual record, assembled from Hill's accounts and from statements made by figures who were present inside the organization during that period, points to something that took longer and happened in a location no surviving account has ever been able to name with precision. The brown paper bag, the gallon of milk, the pencil mustache grown to look older than he was, the audition killing at 17, the shoe shine remark at Robert's Lounge, the body in the trunk that would not stop breathing. All of it ended in an empty room in Queens in January of 1979. The man Joe Pesci would portray 11 years later as a volatile and darkly comedic figure had been dead for more than a decade before the cameras rolled. The Academy Award was collected on his behalf by a performance. The real figure left behind a missing persons report and a wife who had no body to bury. DeSimone walked into an empty room believing it was the beginning of something. It was the end. Next, we close with the man who survived all of it, the narrator, the witness,
and the last phone call to Howard Stern from a hospital bed in Los Angeles. Section 10. Henry Hill, the last wise guy. On the afternoon of April 27, 1980, Henry Hill was arrested in Nassau County on a narcotics trafficking charge. The arrest was the result of a Drug Enforcement Administration surveillance operation that had been tracking a distribution network Hill had been running across multiple states. He was taken to the Nassau County Jail and held while federal investigators assembled what they wanted from him. What they wanted was considerable. They wanted information on the Lufthansa heist. They wanted information on the Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme he had been running with Burke through the 1978 and 1979 seasons. They wanted information on the chain of disappearances that had followed the airport job across the spring of 1979. What changed everything was a surveillance recording. Investigators played Hill a tape of Jimmy Burke discussing the need to have him removed. They played him a second recording of Paul Vario being told the same thing. The two men who had given him his first job at 12 years old, who had brought him through 25 years of work, had decided he was a liability. Hill also understood, listening to those recordings, that the Florida trip Burke had been pushing him to take in the weeks before his arrest had been the setup for his own removal. The trip was to a bar owned by a figure the crew called Charlie the Jap. Hill had declined to go. The declination had kept him alive long enough to sit in the Nassau County Jail and listen to the tapes. He agreed to cooperate the same day. Hill entered the Federal Witness Protection Program in the summer of 1980, alongside his wife Karen and their two children. The family was relocated multiple times across the following 7 years, living under new names in Nebraska, Kentucky, and Washington State. The covers did not hold. Hill was giving interviews under his real name during the same period he was supposed to be operating anonymously. He was cooperating with Nicholas Pileggi on the book that would become Wise Guy, published in January of 1985. He was also using cocaine with enough regularity that complaints were reaching his handlers from neighbors at multiple relocation addresses. The federal government removed the family from the program in 1987, following a narcotics arrest in Seattle. The testimony Hill gave across the years between his cooperation and his removal from the program produced approximately 50 convictions. Burke was convicted in 1982 on the Boston College conspiracy charges and sentenced to 12 years. He was convicted again in 1985 on the Eaton murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. He died of cancer in federal custody in April of 1996, having spent the final 14 years of his life inside the system and having died 12 years before he would have been eligible for parole. Vario was convicted twice on separate charges and died of lung failure at a federal correctional facility in Texas in May of 1988, before the film built around his organization had even begun production. Hill himself kept moving. He separated from Karen in 1989. He was arrested on narcotics charges, weapons charges, and public intoxication charges across multiple states through the 1990s and into the 2000s. He appeared on The Howard Stern Show repeatedly, often by phone, often audibly drunk before noon. He wrote a cookbook. He sold paintings on eBay. He marketed a pasta sauce under his own name. He gave paid appearances at organized crime-themed dinners where audiences paid to sit across from the man who had testified against his entire crew and sent most of them to die in federal custody. He died of heart failure at a Los Angeles hospital on June 12, 2012, the day after his 69th birthday. The cause of death was recorded as complications from chronic heart disease. His fiancée told reporters he had gone out peacefully. Every man who had walked through Paul Vario's cab stand on Pine Street ended up dead in federal custody, dead in a trunk, dead in a refrigerated trailer, or dead in a Los Angeles hospital bed. The Sunday dinners, the tipping, the nightclubs through the kitchen. All of it sat on top of a body count the film could only ever show in fragments. The thing Goodfellas could never fully show was the silence at the end of the line. The crew was in the ground. The narrator outlived all of them and spent his final years selling pasta sauce in California. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.